So welcome everybody. I'm delighted to have Michael Pierce back for the part 2 of the interview. I'll be linking to the first part of the interview in the YouTube video here. Make sure you watch that because that's the foundation. I'm trying to, I've just tremendous respect for Michael. I've learned a lot from him over the years by watching his videos. This is the first time I met with, him on Zoom just a week ago or so. I kind of feel I know him because I've been watching his videos and hearing his voice for years. So what we did last time was we covered a bunch of topics. So I'm just going to bring up, just as an ad for the first video, I'm just going to share the screen and I will tell you what you missed and what you have to go through on that. So we started out. Okay, so we talked about his videos, about the book. This is a huge topic of object versus subject, where, and that we'll kind of do a quick version of it. This is his new organization on functions, I Ching of functions, feminine versus masculine. So that's what we went through. What I'm going to do, Michael, for those people who have missed it, can you just like a couple of minutes on object subject?
Sure, I will do my best. I think you can say object subject is the first chapter of the book and provides the basic foundation for the way that I've chosen to structure the theory. And I consider them, I link them up with yin yang, but the basic idea is in order for anything to happen in psychology, and I would argue even in existence itself, you have to have a subject or something or someone that is perceiving, that is taking in information and processing it in their own mind. And you need something that is outside of them that they can perceive. And as a natural result of this, you get a whole host of different relationships that develop. And so extroversion, for instance, would be the process of the subject focusing more on the object and allowing themselves to be molded by the object. Whereas introversion would be, a focusing and solidifying of the subject's biases and will, and the subject changing the object to fit their needs and abilities. And so that's where those two processes come from, and you can go on down the line through many of the other concepts that Carl Jung talks about and Isabel Myers talk about, such as perception and judgment, which follow the similar thing. Perception is molded more by the object, it receives in information, whereas judgment is the subject moving outwards and changing the object, has a judgment that it applies to the object. And I also introduced the notion of connotation denotation, or you could almost say clarified those concepts. You can find them implicitly in Jung, and then I move on down the line almost deductively from using these different concepts to produce sensation, intuition, thinking, and feeling, and try to create a very binary deduction all the way down to the 16 types. So, but that's the notion of subject-object.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to skip these and I want to start with this conscious versus unconscious. And here, let us start with Carl Jung, because this is such a huge idea, the idea that our consciousness is limited and our self is much, much larger. And what happens to us, or what we do, a lot of it can be understood only by seeing the totality of self, so much of which is unconscious. So this is a huge issue. So let's spend some time on this one. So can you talk about kind of Carl Jung and his approach to the unconscious?
Yeah, so Carl Jung, as most people know, was a student of Freud, who was the one who sort of started out really bringing the notion of an unconscious into psychology. Carl Jung built on that, so I'll talk mostly about him. Carl Jung, in fact, if you listen to Jordan Peterson, I think Peterson does a very good job in many of his videos showing how Carl Jung links up very well with with certain modern ideas in modern biology and psychology. Anyway, Carl Jung's approach to it was to, and if I were a true professional, I would have quotes at the ready for you, but I don't have them memorized. But the way I think of it anyway is that the unconscious for Jung is almost like the body, that there's so many different processes in your body and also in your genetics and in your genetic code. And so your whole history back through the evolutionary chain, through all of your ancestors, all the way into whatever the specific way is that creatures developed, back to, you know, Jordan Peterson brings up the lobsters and their nervous systems and how there are similarities between them and us. Anyway, the idea of the unconscious is the in the book I relate it to the object, because it is almost the objective part of us that forms our body and allows us to do anything and interface with the world. We do all kinds of things that we don't consciously think of. Our heart is beating. We don't have to consciously think of that. But even things we normally would think of should be conscious, like my hand gestures that I'm doing or facial expressions I make. And really 99% of everything that we do is technically unconscious. It's taken care of by processes that are not our ego. But our ego somehow seems to take this leading role in a lot of things, but can also be overcome without us realizing it by unconscious drives and unconscious processes. So Jung's idea was that it's not just a biological thing, but the biology and the history of the individual will penetrate into consciousness and into the psyche and will be represented through archetypal images or through in a person's dreams, in order for the body or for the whole history of the person to make assertions and make its demands for the betterment of the whole person. So in a certain sense, you could say that we're literally all connected, in that we have all descended from the same essential line, and we're connected with everything in nature around us in terms of evolution. And so to come more in touch with oneself is in some sense learning how to reconcile the ego with the totality of existence outside of us. I got very philosophical there, but
that was good. I find this diagram very intriguing.
Yeah.
Could you talk about this imagery and what it signifies?
Yes. So you'll notice that the snake, obviously, that is an Ouroboros. It's a classic symbol that reoccurs all over, and Jung talks about it a fair bit. The Ouroboros is the self-eating snake. So it's a good symbol for eternity and for eternal processes. And especially for dual processes that meld into each other, because in order for the snake to eat itself, it also has to, when you eat something, you bring it into your body and then you use that to recreate more of yourself. We mentioned that last time, the notion of how all of our bodies are constantly taking in stuff and then expelling it, and we're kind of at one with the environment in that way. The Ouroboros helps represent that in a sense. So I used the image to represent the notion of a process and to bring up that notion of the wheel of the psyche. And I wanted to show how last time we had talked about extroversion, introversion, subject, object. You could represent it as the subject is like a bubble and the object is the ocean around it. And obviously this doesn't really happen in nature, but you could imagine stuff getting sort of let into the bubble where it's under different conditions, subjective conditions, and it is changed, and then it is expelled out of the bubble. That would be the more, technically the more, I won't say introverted process, but anyway, it will enter out of the bubble, and it's this cycle. And you can see that here, where, oh, sorry, the psychological and physical unconscious, I'll get into that in a moment, but they're both, it's all still the unconscious realm, the objective realm is the ocean, and it enters into the conscious subject and goes back out. So I was just playing with the idea that when I was first reading Jung, I had it in my head, like I think most people do, that he's talking about there being this outside physical world of just objects like my phone or books and things, and then there's this inner world that has an autonomy synonymous with the outside world, but it's inside of us. It's not the same as the outside world, and so normally we think of it as almost this three-tiered structure where the ego, and that's how Freud tends to describe it, as there's the ego, and then there's the superego, society, and then the id, unconscious, which is the body. Jung, in several places, points out that it's actually better if you, in reality, the external unconscious and the internal unconscious are both still unconscious. They are both part of the object. Your body is still part of the external world. So I was trying to represent that in this diagram. I kind of went all over the place, but didn't know if you wanted me to narrow down.
Yes. So I want to now focus. So we've looked at the larger part of
Yes.
the snake. Now I want to just focus on conscious subject.
Yes.
What is going on there?
What's going on there, I was trying to represent, is that the wheel of the psyche, or the Ouroboros of the psyche, can move in two different directions and can have two different processes. So the snake, I relate the notion of the masculine, the vomiting of the snake producing more of itself that then moves. I keep pointing at it as though you'll see what I'm pointing at, but if it moves in that direction, you can imagine the snake almost expanding as it expels more of itself out into the world and thereby changes the world in its own image, versus the feminine, which is the devouring, where it receives in more of the external world and takes it in and begins digesting it. So it can move this way, and it can also move the other way. And the reason consciousness is a tricky thing for me. I'm very big on consciousness. I talk in the appendices at some length about, and in other places in the book, about what I perceive to be a tendency of modern science, or certain scientists, to want to get rid of the conscious subject, and to say everything is really just, that's just an illusion, and everything is really just unconscious cause and effect. And I just don't think that's true. But I also don't think at this point I have a very good theory for what precisely the conscious subject is, if it's not per se a part of the world. But I think you have to have these two things. I think you have to have a subject who really is perceiving and experiencing things, even though a lot of things are determined by the body and by the structure of a person's brain. There still has to be something there that I call the conscious subject that is experiencing those things and is a determining factor in the world. So I don't know if that helps, or
yeah,
that's where you want to move.
That's good. What we'll do is that we will keep coming back to this issue of conscious and unconscious in various contexts. When we talk about kind of positions and oppositions, things like that. Could you talk about the table that is right below that?
Yes. The table is the result of my trying to provide in my mind, a better basis for the classic function stack. If you're familiar with John Beebe, he, as I understand it, was the one who really kind of solidified the notion of the functions, all of the functions being ranked in a stack for the different 16 types. And I found that incredibly useful. I see it in people. But I wanted to talk about it to show how the functions are arranged in personalities and talk about them in a more complex way. But I was struggling to figure out on what basis I was I would be describing what these different function positions were that the functions could appear in. And used the conscious-unconscious distinction because I found that it linked up to the subject-object distinction I've been making, and it would allow me to create the table. But I also found it to be very useful for describing the differences between the different function positions. So for instance, I relate the auxiliary function I consider to actually be the, quote, most conscious function, which doesn't actually mean it's the most dominant function, precisely because consciousness takes, it's almost like exercising muscles. It takes a certain amount of energy to really concentrate on something. That's why we'll, watch TV and stuff, because we literally need to turn the brain off. That's what we say. We need to become more unconscious. Exercising a great deal of conscious attention to something drains us. And so I think the auxiliary function is, because it is not written more into our body in the way the dominant function is, and that's why it's dominant, we tire of the auxiliary function. So I related them to different kinds of human activity to try to represent, analogize what I was going on. So walking, I think, is more like the dominant function. It's dominant because you do it all the time. It doesn't take as much effort. You're very good at it, and you don't have to think about everything going on. You can focus on the things. You can focus on, where am I going to go? You can change your speed. Swimming tires you out, and you could in fact drown if you're not careful. With the inspiring function, which is the same as the tertiary function, I just wanted to be different, so I called it something different. But I relate it to hunger because, so you'll see, I do make the distinction between, quote, idea and execution, which again relates into the subject-object distinction. I'm always bringing this up to try to help me to divide things. Excuse me. So with the inspiring function, the idea, which is almost the idea is almost the more objective part of it. It's something that arises in you without you wanting it. The execution is the more introverted part, the more judgment part. So I use the term hungering in order to represent the idea that I think the tertiary function is something that kind of comes upon you, and it gives you ideas or goals or things you want to strive for, which is why I believe it's, in socionics, it's sometimes called the secret agenda function. But this drive or desire comes upon you, but then you have to figure out how to move towards it. This is how I think I tend to experience my TI, for example, as in INFJ. It's this feeling, or almost a demand or a command, that I need to organize my NI visions in this TI way. It doesn't tell me how to do it. I have to figure it out, and I have to exert this conscious effort in order to do that. But the desire to do that is unconscious. So that's sort of touching on some of these things.
Excellent. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, now this thing really transformed the way in which I thought about functions. Kind of think, moving to, I went through different stages. I initially started with the MBTI 4 letters, which I did not find it particularly useful by themselves. The next giant step was to say, oh, what really matters are the cognitive functions, the 8 functions, and how am I actually using them? So that was a giant step forward. But the next big step was that of understanding these axes, thinking in terms of these 4 axes, because what it does is that instead of thinking of functions individually, you can see how they are connected to each other. So you can see kind of the strengths and weaknesses as one unit or something like that. So I think, kind of for me, kind of understanding that I need to think in terms of function axis was a huge step. And I thank you for that. I learned it from you, and I think maybe 1 or 2 other people. I don't remember the kind of history of my thought, but
I wasn't the first. I wasn't the first, but yeah.
So tell me, why should people think in terms of function axes?
I find it extremely helpful. Well, I mean, the first answer is because that's just the way that they are. So you should align with reality, but that's a little pompous for me to put it that way. Um, I find it extremely helpful. So first of all, it's always been interesting to me that when Jung actually talks about in how the different he mentions in a number of different places how the different functions really do have this opposition together. So he actually kind of set up the same table in the way that I did. He just didn't have the connotative denotative thing to justify it. So sensation, for instance, is opposed to intuition, feeling is opposed to thinking, and he also opposed extroversion to introversion. So if you're going to put these things into a stack, you're always going to end up putting extroverted sensation opposed to introverted intuition. And as I was studying these in other people and in myself, it just naturally became so much, I just naturally saw the similarities between how the two functions operated and how they tended to blur into each other. So for example, extroverted sensation with introverted intuition, I began realizing that the way that my introverted intuition works when I try to examine it phenomenologically is it's very direct, and it's almost like doing the same kind of thing SE does when I try to move into a more SE mode, but it's doing it internally. And so there's this very visual sense, there's this very, whereas extroverted sensation is very out in the world, looking at specific objects, looking at them as they are, trying to get lost in the world and what's going on. Introverted intuition had a similar sense to it, but was directed internally to these internal images and getting lost in those. And so there's similarities in that respect. There's also the notion that they flow into each other and rely on each other. So introverted intuition doesn't really work unless I have extroverted sensation data to draw my conclusions from. And I end up relating that into the notion that as a function axis, it is a more, quote, contextual axis. It is more subjective. It is a subject in a particular context in the world. And it therefore, SE is sort of the external field of what it can see from its point of view, and it sees it very clearly, but it's limited because it's only a particular context. It's not the entire universe at once, because you can't see the entire universe at once. And from there, you're able to draw these NI conclusions and, quote, predict the future, but it's always contextual. And I oppose that to NESI, which the way that it does things, I think, results in a more universalist approach, where it's not looking at what is immediately in front of it, it's recreating the world in sort of a theoretical way based on its intuitive grasp of the world around it. So those are some basic ideas, but I find it endlessly helpful to see how they flow into each other and to see. You get the idea.
Yes. No, this is very good, man. I really like your explication of the NISE axis and a quick look at the NESI. I think it's worth dwelling a little bit more on these axes. So if we could, because what will happen is that all the further slides, we will be able to refer back to what you've said over here. So could you describe how the TEFI axis and FETI axis work?
Yes, so you'll notice the way I've grouped them is SENI and TEFI are the more contextual axes, and that's why I put them, it gets a little technical why I've put the extroverted denotative, introverted connotative. That's because sensation thinking are more denotative, and they're also extroverted functions because it's SETE. Same thing below, intuition feeling, more connotative, and so you see that's the pattern. So those are more contextual. The other two are more universal. So with TEFI, I start with that because you will see a lot of similarities between it and the way that SENI operates, but it's in the realm of judgment. So, excuse me, extroverted thinking, rather like extroverted sensation, has this sense of wanting to be in the external world and wanting things to be realized in its contextual environment in this denotative way. But SE is about receiving in that information, and extroverted thinking is about making things manifest. Make it so, number one. Sorry, I had to do that. But wants to make things occur in the outside world, and also be hooked in with extroverted thinking facts and judgments, but more about trying to organize the external environment. And it links into this internal sense of FI, the internal goal, the internal values and desires that, again, have this contextual sense to them. They are individual because the whole axis is more subjective. It's based in a certain context that you want to be in touch with. And so FITE will have this both of those function axes will have a more individualistic, especially FITE, where you'll have somebody who has, these are my ideas and I am going to go and do things. FETI is very different, more like NESI, which I touched on. There's this universalist sense to it, where rather than draw in and base everything on what is happening around me in my local environment, which is what TE helps it to do, TI turns away from that external environment and says, I'm going to create laws and principles that are based on what I consider to be more universal principles that transcend my immediate environment. And from those principles, and also editing those principles, will be feeling value judgments that I get from watching other subjects in my environment and sort of polling them, which is what FE tends to do. And so they interact with each other to create these notions of propriety and of duty that are not based on expediency in the immediate environment, but are judgments based on tradition and on principles and on deductive things. And it's more universal. You're trying to you're trying to do God's will or follow transcendent reason. And so that's one of the differences between those two. It's often the difference between expediency with the TEFI and, in a certain sense, SENI, and this universalist Kantian duty or propriety that you tend to get with NESI and FETI. So that's a
excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So now we come to position and opposition. I don't know what's the best way of, talking about it. So I've got two slides on it. I've got this one and I've got this one.
Yeah, I saw that diagram. That is his diagram, by the way.
Yes.
That is his brilliance.
Mine. Yes. That's all mine. All the credit and all the faults are mine. So let me go back here. So what I want to do is, see, most people kind of think in terms of, many people in MBTI think in terms of dominant function and auxiliary function, maybe touch a little bit on the third, inspiring function and the primitive function. But the idea of how do you use, what are the other four functions and what are they doing? John Beebe has done an amazing job, and John Beebe did a full presentation. Richard Owen did a full presentation on his theory. John Beebe participated in that. So many of the people here, about at least half to about maybe 60–70% of the people, have gone through that. So I want you to talk about your take on these 8 functions in terms of the place that they occupy in a person. And then I want to run through an example with INFJ on that. So how about first you talk about each of the 4 kind of unconscious functions, and then we can go ahead and do, how it works in INFJ. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
So I think maybe the best way to do it is they kind of mirror each other, or that's how I've done it, where you have on, we'll say, the more conscious side of the personality, the more preferred side at the very least, dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, or inspiring, as I call it, and primitive / inferior, as it's sometimes called. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then on the other side, sort of mirroring them, you have what I creatively call the subdominant function, the sub-auxiliary, sub-inspiring, sub-primitive, to demonstrate the sort of linkage between them. Part of the reason for the linkage is that, say, a ESFP would be dominant SE, the subdominant would be SI. So it's just the reverse in the attitude, introversion, extroversion, and it goes like that down the line. So in talking about these sub-functions, as it were, which you can either talk about them as functions that are somehow in you, or you can talk about it as just simply the natural relationship you would have with the idea of those functions because you prefer the opposite ones. However you want to do it. The first thing is that it's fairly basic how I do it. Dominant function is most dominant. Subdominant function is you tend to have the best relationship with it. So part also of how they relate to each other is they're always flowing into each other. So one of the things I talk about is how you can conceive of, say, someone who is SE dominant, or at the very least prefers SE. Looking into myself and looking to other people, I have noticed that there's almost a relationship of, I'm moving into SE. I want to be more SE, as though they had been SI somehow before. I don't take that as literally true, but that's almost how I represent the relationship. And so they are moving away from SI. So with the subdominant function, I'll try to talk more specifically about them. With the subdominant function, I think there tends to be a relationship of that's a good start. SI is a good start to a certain problem, and now I will bring in SE to kind of complete the work. With the sub-auxiliary, you lessen the good feelings there so that it's like that, but simply less so. The sub-auxiliary function is valued even less for its own sake, but it's still, you're okay with it. The sub-inspiring function is where things get very interesting, because the inspiring function, as I mentioned before, has this sense of, it almost is like, if you want to represent it mythologically, you're being called on a quest. You're being called to do things in a certain way. And so the sub-inspiring function, being the opposite of that, gets in the way of that. You're trying to go on this quest, and then this thing is opposing you. And so people, I think, tend to have the worst adaptation to their sub-inspiring function. So for me, my inspiring function is TI. That means my personality has the hardest time and has the most conflict generally with TE. So running up against it. And then the sub-primitive function is interesting because it is the primitive function is so kind of made unconscious anyway. The sub-primitive function, it almost like doesn't ever show up. And the reason that becomes interesting, as I talk about a bit in the book, is it actually tends to provide an opportunity for growth, or is usually a good start to growth. There's usually too much tension with the sub-inspiring function for that to be a good starting place. But trying to integrate the lower function, I think, is usually a better starting place. So that's my long sort of my spiel there.
Okay, so what I want to do is that I want to take, the INFJ type and go through it for each of them. So you have so let me ask you as a question for each of them. So let's start with the subdominant. So with NI, how does NE feel to you? When do you use NE? How does NI and NE flow into each other?
So with NE for me, I relate that more to looking at all these multiple different perspectives or multiple different sources. So I start out with that of trying to look at all different people's points of view, trying to accept those points of view, but it is always subordinated to the desire to synthesize them all together into a single NI idea that unites them all and makes sense of them all. I don't look at all these different perspectives ultimately for their own sake. I'm always looking to synthesize them, and will get kind of irritated when I read a book that I feel all they're doing is sort of looking at these different perspectives and never providing me a through line through them.
Okay. Let me do one thing. Let me describe
Sure.
the diagram to everybody. So the two circles, the inner circle is the I of, the introverted parts of the function. The outer circle is the E. This is a diagram this is kind of my version of diagrams that I got from John Beebe. He had like these two separate things, the dominant axis and the kind of the unconscious axis. There's two separate things, two separate kind of crosses. I find it much more easier to kind of view them together, so I can see relationships between them. So the thick yellow lines are the main axis. So the upward arrow now this is a diagram for INFJ. So NI is the dominant function and SE is the primitive function. And then the arrow going to the left, the FE is the auxiliary function, and the TI is the inspirational function. Now, in the smaller thickness lines, the purple lines, those are the other two axes that go in parallel with it. So I've used the complementary colors over there and smaller thickness to say that these are kind of unconscious. And the red lines are, represent the interaction between one function and its subversion. So that's a diagram, because I find it easier to kind of think of it in an integrated way. So now one question I would ask is, I asked when John Beebe was here, I asked him about the opposing functionality. He calls the NE in this case, the subdominant one, opposing personality.
Okay.
And he said, look, that to him was the biggest thing that he learned about the functions through the 8-function model of how the subdominant works. So like, do you experience the subdominant as opposing, in the sense that is it just opposing in kind of like, for example, like the way in which the sub-inspiring one, that would, you would kind of feel bad about it, would kind of almost irritate you, and you have to kind of work against that. But I don't feel that about the opposing, the opposing function or the subdominant function. It seems to be just the opposite direction or something like that. For it's to me, it's like breathing in and breathing out, but something like that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say it can be irritating. I think the way I would put it is that when someone is a dominant NI type, for instance, that means that the NI always needs to be the subordinate. It always has to have the last word, as it were, and everything needs to be. But because it's dominant, that actually means that extroverted intuition, it knows better how to use that to its advantage. And so as long as the wheel is turning in the right direction, as it were, everything's fine. But when you run up against somebody who goes the other direction, where NE is the end-all be-all, then bam, you get conflict. And also when you are forced to try to make NE the end-all be-all, that causes problems. I think I've told this story before, but I had a professor who I believe was an ENTP, And it was fascinating, but he had a number of projects that he had us do, which I realized very quickly were very much designed to get us to think like an ENTP, because he's like, this is the way to do it. And it was very frustrating, because I realized I didn't know up to that point just how much. I'm trying to think of one of the examples. He emphasized, for instance, he wanted us to do a paper where we weren't supposed to ever do that synthesizing motion. We were supposed to continually explode ideas and explore all of the different, things that come from an idea. So to take one idea and to say, break it up into a bunch of parts and then analyze each of those parts. And I always wanted to say, but I don't care about these other parts. I care about this part. This is the essence. And I would keep doing that. And it was very frustrating to do the fireworks thing. So that's an example of them coming into conflict. So it can do both, in my thinking anyway.
Excellent. So now let's jump to the sub-inspiring, because one of the really stunning things that I read in your book is that you think of types in terms of dominant followed by not sub-inspiring. So why do you place this level of importance on that? And can you talk about how the TE works for you?
Yes. So the notation that I use for the types, as you mentioned, is to do the dominant function and then the sub-inspiring function next to it, because I felt that that was the quickest and easiest way to show sort of encapsulate the essence of the type. And it's also different for every type. You see what they prefer doing the most and what they prefer doing the least, or have the most conflict with. So for example, the sub-inspiring function for me would be TE. And I actually think, somewhat ironically, that this manifests a lot in the animosity I often will express or feel, and that you read in the introduction of the book, where I'm trying to get away from the TE approach to psychology, to using empirical research and stuff to try to study the brain. I try to move away from that by saying you won't be able to verify in that way the things I want to explore and talk about. And I think it's a weird thing where I think I'm correct on that, but I also realize it is definitely motivated by a preference. I want to move things into the TI realm because I'm much more comfortable there dealing with just the ideas. I have found I will get very frustrated when someone will try to make their point by bringing up, say, a study that was done, or bringing up, I've compiled all this evidence. I'm like, I want reasons. I don't want evidence. I want to philosophically reason out. That's how I think of it. And for those of you who might be bristling and frustrated with the way I'm presenting it, it's probably because you actually value TE and can deal with it. So don't feel bad. I'm just angry because I can't do it very well. Well. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, that's excellent. That's excellent. The other point that I was really taken aback on is the amount of time that you've spent in the book, amount of words, pages, talking about this opposition between the NI and SI versions of functions, NI versus SI, NE versus SE. So how do you experience SI?
That is the question, because it's often difficult for me to say. It's ghostly. I think that's often how the subprimitive is for people. It's usually the one they have a lot of trouble describing or even conceptualizing. I believe for me, SI manifests in a couple of ways. The most obvious is in the fact I am not very good with SI parts of my life. I struggle with, maybe a more dramatic example is I have a friend who is, I believe, an INTJ, and it's very easy for them to fall out of having any kind of set schedule. On the one, they'll kind of have a schedule, but they'll get caught up in a project, or they'll say, I have this NI vision, I need to finish this thing, and they won't sleep for a night. And then they'll totally mess up their circadian rhythm, and they won't have any traditions. They just kind of are blown about on the wind. And it's like they lose touch with the SI part of their body because, and in a weird way, it actually can be taken as a manifestation both of NI and SE. They're losing themselves to both kind of being blown about by SE winds and also by internal NI winds, and they're not grounded enough or anchored enough in what they need in their environment. So I've noticed that in myself in a certain degree, in a certain extent, where I've realized I really have to push myself to try to take care of certain things that are very routine and that I can't really think deeply about anything while I'm doing them. They take too much concentration. I can't think about philosophy while I'm doing my taxes. I can't think about philosophy when I'm exercising. And it's very frustrating. So I know it's not that if you don't like exercising, you are thereby an NI type. Obviously, that's not what I mean, but that's one way it manifests. I've noticed I have a very difficult time. I won't pay attention to more sensation, what I consider more SI things. I can't remember addresses. I can't remember phone numbers. I can't remember anything that's more detailed, but I'll remember these general concepts. I'll remember, Shrikant, I will remember elements of your personality, but I'll forget like that you were bald. Like my brain just won't remember that. It will be like, I think he had brown hair, or I don't know if he had glasses, but I remember I could draw in a weird picture that expresses the essence of Shrikant, as I remember. So things like that, you know.
Okay, very interesting, very interesting. So let's come to the final one, the sub-auxiliary one. How is sub-auxiliary one experienced in INFJ? How is FE, a field of FI, different from field of FE, and when do they come in and how do they flow?
Yes. This is an interesting one, and actually I think it might be the one I spend the least amount of time in the book. So, and that might manifest I understand it the least, but here's what I do understand. With FI, there's elements there of sort of a similar degree of antagonism that I'll have with TE, but it's more mellowed. And I think also there's more FI in me than I am sometimes ready to admit. So what I mean by that is, especially when I was first getting into typology, one of the first breakthroughs I had was when I was reading, I think it was Emerson, and he was expressing ideas that I consider now to be very FI, about you need to follow your own star and follow the beat of your own drummer. And I remember reading that and thinking to myself, but then society would collapse. Like, what are you talking about? Like, not everyone can do just whatever you want, like at any moment. Like, if I did that, who knows what I would do? Like, you have to have duty and things. And suddenly I realized, I wonder if this is a typology difference. Like, is this an FE-FI difference? And that was the first time I really realized the practical application this could have in being able to read philosophy without just getting angry at everybody because of everybody has to be like me. So I tell that because that's a good example of one of where you'll see some of the opposition. There will be a sense of you have to be better hooked in with what other people are feeling. Like, that's my FE. It's very sensitive to these external signs. But on the other hand, there is an attraction I've noticed towards FI that it's frankly, it's difficult for me to explain because I think I'm more used to running into problems against it in other people. But at the same time, I think it actually can, you'll see it in the way that I go about my FE. People tell me I'm sometimes off-puttingly honest with people and open with people, and I am very big about, I'm very feeling about my principles that I have and that I want to put forward. And so it's kind of interesting there. So it's like, it's good in me, it's not good in you, or something, something maybe like that, a hypocrisy
Okay,
like that.
one last question
Yes.
about this diagram before we go on. One of the things that we do is that we always try to take ideas of different people and compare them against one another. It's kind of, we call it the syntopical approach that I learned from Mortimer Adler, from How to Read a Book. So I want to compare what we just talked about to John Beebe's notions and his names and his archetypes for each of those four. So he calls, he would call NE over there the opposing function, FI, they're the crone, the TE to be the trickster, and SI to be the demon. Do these terms kind of are similar to how you think about things? Different, or is there any one of them which is kind of different in your perspective than how he approaches it?
Well, we talked a little bit about the opposing. I would suggest it could go both ways.
Yep.
I do rather like the notion of the demon and the trickster. I think that that's an apt archetype, the trickster, because it will tend to trip up the person, and that's why they get so frustrated with it. The demon, because in the book, I actually spend a fair bit of time, and I haven't talked much about this because I wanted to get straight to the concepts, but of linking this up with elements of the Lakota mythology, which I found there were a remarkable number of analogies. Anyway, I mention that because the as I call it, the sub-primitive, John Beebe calls it the demon. In the Lakota mythology, what links up with the sub-primitive function is a kind of demon, or daimon, if you want to make it neutral. This figure that confronts you and that you don't understand, but by confronting it and being able to overcome it, it facilitates growth. And so I like that notion. I don't know if that's how John Beebe talks about it. It's a very odd thing because I use the 8 functions, but you'll notice I don't list John Beebe as an inspiration. I couldn't do so in good conscience because I've never read anything he's written. And I feel bad about that most of my notions, I think, really have come from him, but it's always been at secondhand. So maybe I have a bit of a bad conscience about that, I'm afraid. But the crone I need to look more up on. I'm not quite sure what he means by that. I'd be fascinated if it could help me a bit better.
So, I mean, the way I understand it is that the FE function is like the guiding function. It's like the, kind of like a father who is lovingly guiding your dominant function. Whereas the crone function is like a bad parent who keeps on criticizing you, or who keeps on kind of showing all the negative things about you, something like that. That's how he looks at it. But we can we can talk about it another time. All right, so now we're going to go to the 4 temperaments, and then we're going to go into the 16 types. All right, so first question for you. You talked about the contextual axes and universal axes. So there are, of these 4, there are 2 which are both are contextual, and there are 2 where both are universal. Is there, and there are the other ones where one is universal and one is contextual. Is there a dramatic difference between those 2? Kind of, are they kind of more extreme in some sense, or what's how would you how do you think about them?
I've thought a lot about that since I kind of had developed the model. I have a few thoughts, though I'll admit I don't think they are sufficient to the magnitude of the problem that appears here. In my observations, I don't think there's anything radically different in how types manifest themselves. I have theorized that it would imply that looking at the diagram, the theocratic and the anarchic types which are sort of the hybrid types between the
Mhm.
universal and contextual, could potentially serve as mediators between the more pure types. That was an original theory, but a part of me doesn't like the privilege that seems to give the theocratic and anarchic. It almost is like, well, they know more of reality by nature, and I'm like, we cannot do that. We can't do that in our type theory. And I have also seen that there are people I know who I would consider more monarchic or more democratic that have at times actually also been the mediators between the theocratic and the anarchic. Because, so I guess the ultimate answer is no. I don't think there's a radical difference, but this faces how I'll end that conversation.
Okay, sure.
Sorry.
Sure.
Anyway, don't want to drag on too long.
Okay, that's fine. So, so let's talk about the 4 temperaments. Can you talk about each of them?
Gladly. It hooks in, like so many things, it's almost fractal, where on a previous slide, you saw the, say, conscious execution, conscious idea led to the auxiliary function. I'm always doing this with the graph. So the monarchic is the most contextual. So you'll look in the diagram, I relate them to the 4 elements because that's just how I am. And I relate the monarchic to air. The idea is that because the monarchic is the most contextual, I call them monarchic because each individual is like their own monarch. They are wholly focused on that motion from the inside of the pure subject outwards into the world. So they are always focused on, I'm an individual and I am trying to change the external world in accord with what I need. You see this with the NTJs. They're very good at that. They'll have a vision, they'll have a dream, a desire, and they're really on when they feel they're able to figure out how to break down the external world and mold it like clay. And I think you also see that with the SFPs. It's just not as obvious in how we're trained. And then you kind of can go around. The democratic would be the opposite of that, where it's an inward moving motion. So they are letting the universe speak to them, and more specifically, they are trying to live according to principles that are not them. They're trying to conform their body with something that is outside of them. So it's what I would call this more objective, extroverted motion. And so I call them democratic because rather than having a single monarch with a will that, you know, rules the kingdom, they let the kingdom tell them what is the right thing to do. And they take an average. It's not like they're drawn apart by this. They take an average, which is their principle. The theocratic is a mixture. So you'll notice I oppose the air to the earth. The air is up at the top of the pyramid. It's like a single point. Where everything is contextual, it's the subject, whereas the earth, everything is flattened out. So the theocratic, starts in the sense that its perception of the world is very contextual, it's very individual and very outward moving, but their judgment, the way they'll actually deal with the world, is very receptive. And so ultimately what this means is that, like a, quote, theocrat, in a theocratic society, God rules, but it rules through sort of a priest system. So there's this weird mixture of listening to the universe, but the way I talk about it in the book is it's disseminating inspiration to the masses. So there's this, they have very highly contextual ideas that they are trying to universalize for other people's consumption. I think Carl Jung is an example of this because while on the one hand he had almost like visions and ideas of what was the correct answer, he wouldn't just straight up tell people that. He would hold back some of the information and let people know what he felt, or tell people things in a way that he felt would help them understand it better. The anarchic type is the opposite of that, the opposite motion, where the theocrat is going down the pyramid, whereas the anarchic is going up the pyramid. So the anarchic starts out by seeing things, perceiving the world in this more democratic way, letting the world speak to them. And then they take that and try to individualize themselves and to help other people individualize themselves. So you get this notion of we're all in this together, but we're all separate individuals. And so that's why I call them anarchic, because there is no government. Everybody is, we're all kind of in this together, but everybody's an individual. So there you go. That's my quick moment of it.
Excellent. Excellent. So shall we go to the final slide here?
Sure.
On 16 types. So can you talk about each of these groups? I don't know what's the best way of talking about the 16 types here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I will do my best. Obviously, it's complex, but this is a very handy diagram, and I do think it helps to have. It especially helps when you have this many people or rather types, as it were, to have images, almost archetypes in your mind that you can link things up with. So the historical figures are very helpful for that. So I group them into the different groups. You see that the STPs and NFJs are the theocrats, the NTJs and SFPs are monarchs, STJs and NFPs are anarchists, and the NTP and SFJ are the Democrats. I'm wondering if I think I can go very quickly through each one of the types. And if you're familiar with MBTI, this won't be terribly new to you. And you definitely will need to read the book to see or watch my videos that I've created. But what's the best way to do this? The ENTJ, I call in the book the mountain mover. This is because there's a sense with them that they, the way you move a mountain is you break it up into lots of pieces and then you move them one bit at a time. The ENTJ has a vision and they're very focused through TE on affecting that vision in the world and getting things done. And so they'll be very big thinking. Like Napoleon, he conquers all of Europe and ultimately collapses because he tries to do too much at once. Kind of a classic thing going on. So actually the best way to do this, sorry, I keep switching, is to dominant function, sub-inspiring function. So with the ENTJ, dominant function's TE, get stuff done in the world. Sub-inspiring function is SI, so almost like negative SI. So they try to get too much stuff done. They try to get too much stuff done in the world. They forget about their own body and its needs. And they also forget about the body and needs, the individual needs of others. They want to get things done in one external reality. And so they're like a combine harvester. They chew up all of the poor mice in the field as they go, through. In fact, let me quickly open up my copy of the book here just to make sure I don't take too long fumbling around. The ESFP would be SETI, or rather SE negative TI. So I describe them as almost like a train that is so fast and so like exhilarant with life that it just hops off the rails sometimes. It doesn't keep itself to duty or to reason. It's too excited about the world and wants to rush into it. The INTJ would be NI negative FE. They're the mad scientist on the top of the hill that the mob realizes is doing horrifying experiments that it doesn't agree with, so an angry mob comes and attacks them. These are all stereotypes and things, but it's helpful. The ISFP is FI negative NE. They are the artist who doesn't like to talk about their art, and so nobody understands them, but they know that what they're doing looks good, but they don't know how to talk about it. They don't know how to and they also don't know how to deal with other people's perspectives. They know their realm of what their art is, and they want to just do that. And they want to sort of secretly follow their NI. They don't want to have to deal with questioning themselves. Similar thing with the ISTP, moving over to the theocratic, except TI is the dominant function. So it gets interesting there because I relate them to like a monk. So they hold to principles, and they have Miyamoto Musashi or Bruce Lee is another great example. They'll be very quiet. They have their principles. They have their way of going about the world, and they don't like having to constantly defer to other people's judgment about it or other alternate perspectives. They know what the way is. The ESTP is SE negative FI. So they want to be connected with reality, but they are not very good, or they don't understand or see the point in dealing with what they might consider other people's individual feelings. And they also don't have those themselves. They want to, it relates into the ENTP, which I know I'm jumping around a bit, but the ENTP is NE negative FI. So it's a similar thing where the ENTP wants to explore all the different ideas in the world, and they don't want to be held back by people's internal feeling qualms. And they also feel that everything would work out better if everybody would just let go of their internal prejudices and hold hands and be together. How am I doing on time here?
You're doing perfectly fine.
Okay.
You're going at a good rate.
Okay. The INFJ would be NI negative TE. They have visions and ideas that do not have, will often have trouble having clear TE application to changing things in the world. It's almost like they get too off the ground. It's different from the INTJ, who always wants to affect their visions and ideas in the world, and by doing so will offend everybody. And so the ENFJ would be FE negative SI. So you see connection with the ENTJ, but with the ENFJ, they want to unite everybody to their vision or idea, but they are perhaps overwilling to tread on other people's individual experiences of reality to get everybody onto the same page. So Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter in Birmingham jail, he talks about how he talks about prejudice as like a pustule that we need to open up, have it burst, and let the sunlight rush in. It's literally like the bubble extroversion analysis. He's saying we need to pop everybody's subject so that we can all kind of mush together in the external dance. And that can be a problem when you're dealing with individual SI types. The ESTJ would be TE negative NI. So they're the opposite of the INFJ, right? They want to get things done in the world, and they don't want to get too caught up in visions that have nothing to do with the world. So they'll tend to not be philosophical in the way that the INFJ is philosophical. They want everything to be in the here and now. And the ISTJ is SI negative FE, kind of like the INTJ, except here they're focused on emphasizing the sort of the phenomenology of their environment and what they are doing right now. I think that, Washington's a good example. He was very conservative in his generalship, but at the same time, the traditions and things that they will emphasize, or the ideas that it's like, if you're going to survive in this world, you have to do this, will not be calculated with propriety in mind. So Freud can be a good example, because he's like, the world is cruel and everybody has an id and everybody wants to kill each other, and that's just the way it is. And I'm sorry that you feel bad about that, but I don't care about your FE. The INFP is FI negative SE. So internal feelings that are not linked up with external reality as it is happening at every moment. So a lot of INFPs will have this, they'll have this dreaminess or they'll have that in their character because they want to explore eternal realms that are not, eternal ideals or eternal realms that are not linked up with the here and now that is happening. And they'll often oppose themselves to the notion of the crowd, because the crowd is always shifting and changing, but they want to be an individual in eternity. The ENFP is NE negative TI, so kind of like the ESFP. They want to explore all of the ideas in the entire universe, and they don't want to be bound down by the annoying deductive logic of the INTP or the ISTP. They want to be able to explore everything and have all kinds of wacky ideas. You get like Dr. Seuss with his impossible geometry and things, you know, because it's fun to look at. It doesn't have to make sense. The INTP, on the other hand, is TI negative SE. It's like the INFP, but it's with principles, ideas. They want to know how the universe itself works at all times and all places. They don't care about the here and now. You know, Einstein, he figures out his ideas in sitting in his armchair, not like Newton, who's more of an INTJ, who's running sort of like experiments and observation and stuff. So different there. I talked a bit about ENTP. You know, I call them the devil's advocate in the book because they'll often play that role, where, you know, people will be like, it's like you have, similar with the ESTP, people will often feel like they have no soul or like no morals or anything, that they just sort of go with whatever's happening. The ISFJ is SI negative TE, so like the INFJ, except it's applied to traditions and the environment, and to keeping track of your own body in the environment. You'll notice all my explanations of SI, I feel, are very weak. Like I've said before, I just keep struggling. I'm like, what even is this stupid thing? I'm just like, anyway, but they are, they're like the duty keepers. They're like the keeper of the garden or of a place. They want to keep things. They hold the most to the sense of duty and not expediency, propriety, not expediency. They're kind of the opposite of the ENTJ, who wants to create a mega super highway because it'll benefit everybody. And the ISFJ is like, but look at how many graveyards and churches you have to destroy in order to create it. Like, this is ancient architecture. What are you doing? The ESFJ, finally, last but not least, certainly, is FE negative NI, kind of like ESTJ. The ESFJ is usually leading the mob against the INTJ because they're like, how could you? I'm sorry. It's FE, but they will struggle with NI because they'll feel it has no real basis. It's just, you just came up with this crazy like schizoid idea that you think prophesize the future, but I don't see what it's based on. Like, and what's worse is that at least I can deal with the INFJ because they just sit on their mountaintop and can be crazy alone, but the INTJ keeps on trying to change society and we can't have that. So that's kind of the ESFJ.
Excellent.
16 types.
Yes, 16. Yeah, 16 types in 5 minutes. And this was really good because what happens is that you kind of took, discussed each of them from your kind of classification system of dominant and this one. So that was very, very helpful. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and I'm going to open it up for questions, folks. So we have several questions. It's difficult for me to go through all of them right now, but it's going to be, we have four rules that we use all the time. Number one, you raise your hand when you have a question. You can do that by typing a question, typing exclamation mark, or raising your hand in Zoom. Rule number two, keep on topic. Rule number three, be brief. And rule number four, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything anybody says, but be courteous. Okay, so it's going to be Joe, Dino, and Brad next. Keep asking your questions. We'll take them as they come in. Joe, go ahead. Just a second. Let me just make sure that the settings. Okay, Joe, you can unmute yourself now.
Hi, Michael. Actually, you ended up like kind of answering my question, but I mean, I know that you don't particularly cover, heuristics and bias in this formula, but how does the denotative and the connotative relate to that at least. Can you maybe expand a little bit as to why you don't feel it doesn't, you didn't go down that road, and if it does relate, and if you could expand on that, either or.
Sure. Relating to heuristics, like
system ones and system twos.
Yeah.
So that's because I'm trying to draw it out in a graph, just as you did, and I'm trying to figure out where the system one and system two would actually fall within that graph.
Yeah. I would put them, and I only say this with reservation because I don't think I've thought nearly enough about it. I didn't have the system one, system two, like from Thinking Fast and Slow or some of these things in mind when I was writing it. It was only afterwards that I realized there might be a connection with the connotative denotative. My notion would be that the denotative, I can't remember the distinction between the system one and system two, but I know thinking slow is the more detailed, more almost,
System one is instinctive and emotional,
okay.
Whereas system two is deliberate and logical.
Yeah, so I would relate the denotative to the system two, and the connotative to the system one, which is why the connotative is faster. And Nietzsche points this out, and I noted in the book when trying to describe the difference, he relates the system one would be almost like one's intuition. And my contention would simply be that I think sometimes people will think that, system one, there's not a whole lot to it. It's very primitive. It's simple. It's like an animal. And it's like, actually, it's incredibly complicated. There's a lot going on there. And as you make that conscious, it has a lot of ideas. So that's how I would link them up. Denotative takes longer because it's questioning everything and trying to look at everything. And so it'll be more detail oriented and also feel to the intuition more crusty and a killjoy. And, so there you go.
Next one up is Dino. Dino, go ahead.
I have just a simple question. I very associate myself as an INTP. I'm very secure with that title. But I noticed that a lot of people are always trying to convince me that I'm an extrovert or insisting that I'm an extrovert. And I don't identify with that at all. And I'm just wondering if that's something that's, if there's a reason why an INTP would be mistaken for an introvert, for an extrovert, or if that's just me.
Well, I don't know you. I would say two things. One, haters gonna hate. Yeah. Sorry, I'm being facetious, but if you're comfortable with the INTP, you keep on with that. I would say that I don't know. I really don't know why they might say that. I guess I'd have to hear what their reasons for that would be. If they think people have told me when I'm at parties or things sometimes, and I'll become more extroverted, or even maybe now I could see people saying, I don't know if he's really an INFJ. He seems very, very happy and extroverted. And I could see how people could become confused because of that. But in some sense, I try to move away from the more traditional way of looking at introversion, extroversion, and make it so that it's more about the processes actually going on in your head and less about necessarily how it would manifest in the world, which is in part my own prejudice, as I mentioned before. I tend to move perhaps too much away from TE, but anyway, that's not helping to answer your question. So
okay,
I hope that helps.
Yeah.
For me, it's like, I'm the type of person that I do put on a show. I am a teacher, and so I get very alive. And if it's an area of interest, like people are talking about movies or they're talking about something that I'm really into, I will really go all out. But otherwise, I stay away from the topic. I might insert a joke and then walk away.
Yeah, it's like another professor I had who, anyway.
Okay, next one up is Brad. Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for all your work, both of you. This has been great.
Thank you.
My question is actually pretty related to this. It involves how to go about typing people, given that we only see so much of them, so much of their lives, so much of their thoughts. I feel like between these events and your book and everything, I have all these tools, and I'm amazed by the ingenuity of the tools. But then when I'm told to use them to go build a birdhouse or whatever, it's like, what do I even do?
Yeah.
It's very complicated. So just what's worked for you in terms of these archetypes, the functions? What's your process? How does this work?
Sure. In fact, this actually does relate to what I'd previously said. I think one of my failings actually is, and I link this in with the INFJ, is, like you said, I think I'm very good at providing tools. I'll struggle when it comes to figuring out how to practically apply them. So I apologize for that. I think it's to be expected. However, I will say this. I have made a couple of videos where I've at least tried to broach the subject. It's tough, man. Unfortunately, I often find I'll meet people and I'll watch them and I'll try to do a more systematic way of typing them, and I'll end up just falling back on intuition, and that's not really good enough. But I think, I don't know if it's ever possible to fully get away from the need to use a certain amount of intuition. I mean, it's not accountable in any scientific way, and that's a problem, but these concepts can be so slippery when watching people. So to try to better answer your question, I need to work more on that to figure out how to better help people know how to type people. But for now, my process is often almost not a process. I just watch them and take in the info and kind of am like, they seem to be showing patterns of this type, and I find that more useful in understanding their behavior, and it'll be more utilitarian. So I apologize, I can't answer it any better than that, but that's where I'm at right now.
Okay. Yeah, if
go ahead. No, go ahead, Brad.
Just, is that intuitive process like using some of those archetypes and examples from that last slide more, or is it more?
Yes. So getting an idea clearly in my head of what do these types tend to look like, and I think it gets easier as you meet more people, that you become more confident. They're definitely of this type, and then as you meet more people, you can see, yeah, I see the similarities between them.
That's cool.
Yeah, so it's a more organic process, I think.
That's what I was after. Thank you.
Let me ask a follow-up. How much do you use kind of the self-reports of people? How much do you ask them, or do you rely almost entirely on your process?
I'll ask people. I don't have any kind of official typing service or anything like that. So, but and a lot of the people I've sort of typed haven't necessarily taken a test, or if they do, I might disagree with it, or sometimes I agree with it. I'll certainly ask them, because in some cases I will find, as bad as this sounds, I have met many people who I at least currently feel are ENFPs, and every single one took a type test and has typed as different types several times and are frustrated and don't know what they are, and usually will ask me usually they're the ones who ask me questions about, do you think that there's another like axis or something that we could insert here? They're always trying to get away from the excluded middle.
Okay.
Anyway.
So it's going to be Loy, Vincent, and Sioned next. Loy, go ahead. Loy, you need to unmute yourself.
I know. Okay. I have two questions. One is those people who are right in the middle of two types. And the other question is, can our type change with different stage in life? Because I remember I was much more extroverted when I was young. And now I am become more introspective.
two lines, common question, 2 lines of thought on that. One is, so for the first question, I talk a bit in the book how there's 2 ways you can approach it. I choose to present the types as these are almost like they're types. They're like archetypes that you will find yourself. I do believe people will find themselves relating more to one over the other, and so people will tend to spread into these groups. But when you try to create a test or something, then you will necessarily find that rather than everybody kind of doing this platonic thing where everybody splits into these different groups, everybody will be peppered, and you'll have people who will be in between types. And I suppose my answer is it's more of a result of methodology. I can't tell a person that, no, you think you're between types, but you're really this type, and I say so, and therefore you must believe me. I have no authority to say that to somebody, so I choose not to. But I'll admit there's a part of me that just simply wants to simplify it and say you fit into one or the other, but maybe not a satisfying answer. The second question that maybe we'll build on that is, and I talked about it a bit in the last session, is can people change types? I originally was more kind of like, I don't think so. I've opened more up to that, because personality just as a whole, separate from just MBTI or from the Jungian concepts, that certainly changes. That clearly can change over time. And it'll take common patterns, like you mentioned, where as people will age, a lot of people will note what you note, where they'll become more introverted, more introspective. Whether or not it is best to reflect that in the type theory, or whether it is better to say that the individual types can be themselves dynamic and can unfold in a certain way. You know, some people will describe this as you might get older, you'll focus more on different functions, and maybe that's a better way to describe it. I don't have an answer, but like I said before, I try to be very hands-off on telling people what type you are, or if you've switched types, you know. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Next one up is Sioned. Sioned, go ahead.
Okay, let me just find my question. It was not dissimilar. Sorry. Yeah, to what extent, Michael, is it possible, in your opinion, or based on your research to date, to consciously switch types, for example, for a few hours, knowing your audience or an event or whatever? And if yes, to what extent, for example, 1 out of the 4, INTJ to INFJ, for example, or extremely, or an extremity, i.e. changing all 4? Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting question. I would say, I think part of the problem in my figuring out how to answer that question, and also the changing type in general question, is it forces me to start running up against to what degree I start running up against my own methodology and how I even think about the types. I think the first answer I would give is that no, the way I think about types is that it's fairly fixed, because and the changes in a person can all be explained in terms of the type, and if you change how you present yourself. But my second answer that I would give to kind of try to balance that out is that it certainly is the case that people can go into slightly different states of consciousness, or can teach themselves to consciously do that, say to overcome public speaking fears and things like that. And if it is useful for that person to describe that in terms of I turn into another type, I tend to be maybe perhaps too overly pragmatic. I tend to think if it works, go with it. But and in some sense, yeah, you could say that it is easier to model a person's changing types by saying they start acting like another type. And I think there could be benefit to say showing how individuals can sort of slosh between the types within their own temperament. I've played with that. I do think that can be frequent, and part of that is it depends on the way you decide to measure the types. You could also perhaps see an INFJ start to act more like a stereotypical ENFP in certain situations. So I don't think I have a fixed answer for you, I'm afraid, but those are my thoughts on it at any rate. So someone else has got to write another book where they can critique me and provide some more thoughts on it. So
excellent. Okay, so there was a question. I'm not sure whether it was relevant or not, but what we can do is that let's now let me see, David. David, go ahead. You can ask your question.
Hi, thanks very much. Yeah, following up on the previous one, sort of prompted me, Michael, of the difference between roles, because as you're saying, you're somewhat more extroverted now in this public presentation you're doing than you are naturally. And the person was mentioning the other question about being, on a stage or doing something. And so in these different roles, or people are different at the office versus at home versus other things. So how do you, sort of digging further, how do you differentiate those different intentional personalities? And one could also get into like dissociative disorder, where you actually have people literally different personalities, associate that with these MBTI types and people changing. In other words, because at least you seem to imply, not to belabor this question, but that there's sort of a fundamental type that the person has, and different types are being expressed in different ways versus truly fundamental personalities in the brain, and different personalities are on or off, and those fundamental personalities map to different MBTI types.
Thank you for that question, because that actually helps consolidate, that nicely consolidates sort of the problem there. Yeah. I certainly do, and I had mentioned before my strong sense of there is an ego, there is an identity, there is an I, but clearly people will, like you said, will even have almost like sub-personalities that will turn on in different situations. And so the question being how, I'm just repeating what you're saying, but the question being, how do you differentiate, it's actually a classic philosophical problem. How do you differentiate the ephemeral, the external showing of something, and what the thing in itself actually is? And can the thing in itself have a nature of its own? I don't have an answer, but I can reiterate my prejudice that I do think there is an I and ego, and I think it can be characterized in a certain way, but there can also be different modes and expressions of it. So I can reiterate my position, but I don't think I can provide yet very much good reasoning other than I just told you so. But I hope that helps, at least with knowing where I'm at, so so you can move forward with your own thinking and contradict me if need be. I hope to be humble and willing to learn from my students, as it were.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Michael. This is just fantastic. Thank you very much for coming back for the seconds, and we managed to cover a lot of ground. So now we're going to do, folks, we are now going to do breakout rooms for